Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. I will speak in English, even though, of course, I would like to say just a few words in French to thank the organizers of this moment. So, merci beaucoup, Antonio, pour cette invitation, ainsi que toute l'équipe des linguistes et au-delà de la discipline linguistique, des collègues et chercheurs, jeunes et moins jeunes, de l'Université du Costa Rica. I had the pleasure and the joy to come in person in Costa Rica to this university and visit the department a few years ago before the pandemics. And that I think it was back in 2016 or something like that. And so I was very impressed at the time to see the vivacity of the Department of Linguistics and all the humanities in the university. Today, I'm going to address a very complicated subject. It's very complicated because it's at the same time something very, very common to everyone. It's the topic of emotions. We all feel emotions all the time. That's probably one of the things that makes us humans, basically. So we have emotions, we live, we have an affective life. And at the same time, it is very difficult to talk about emotions. And for what concerns linguistics, to talk about emotions in language, and in particular in terms of meanings, right? So it's a bit of a paradox that we have this complications associated with something very, very familiar to everyone. So let me first perhaps share my PowerPoint. Yeah, and I'll let you tell me if that's working at the moment. Yeah, I think it is working. It's okay?
Yes, it is.
Very good. Thank you very much. So, so basically, I will address a few examples of how emotions are manifested in language. But my talk will be mostly theoretical, and perhaps at times you will find it a little bit messy, but that's because the notion of emotion, affects, is, in particular, if you consider it from the perspective of pragmatics and communication, is really a little bit messy. Right. So I will use notions of emotions and affects mostly interchangeably I mean, with not too strong commitments about what they are, but I'm going to look a little bit about what theory of emotion says and can tell us. Right. So first I will just give a few words of introduction about emotions and how and why it was sort of dismissed in the theory of languages until recently, and apart from a few examples. And then I would turn to affects, try to see what these things are. Then I will turn to some examples and try to identify a few properties of expressive meaning, of expressives, which is traditionally the category of words that fill this role or function of expressing directly emotions, not describing them, but expressing them. And then I would try to see if and how these types of linguistic items can be integrated into a cognitive theory of pragmatics and of meanings. And if time allows, I will look at a few epistemic outcomes of affective effects, because it's one of the classics in discourse analysis and rhetorics, in persuasion studies, heuristics, and so on, that emotional stances, emotional claims, or appeals to emotions have a powerful persuasive impact, or epistemic impact, if you want to use that word. Well, the ancient view, so to say, is that reason and emotion are opposed, are two opposing forces, are irreconcilable, they can't be together, and so on. The old wording for emotion is passion. That's what you find in classical texts. And in order to figure out what's going on in the classical age, or in fact, throughout European thinking, with this opposition between reason and passion, has to be considered that reason is central to the notion that humans were created to the image of God, and God being all-knowing and having perfect wisdom. Reason is considered what makes us superior to other animal species. That reason is what defines the mind and the quality of being a human. On the other side, passion or emotions is something which is seen as parasitic, harmful, has a disruptive character for decision making. It's nature, basically, in its roughest aspect. It belongs to the body. It is antinomic to wisdom, knowledge, and basically passion, emotion is an obstacle to civilization. So, of course, there are a number of scholars from the antiquity who rehabilitate the notion that emotion plays a positive role. I'm not going to go through all these theories, but what I want to emphasize is basically the ground for which reason was envisaged as the thing that was a subject of interest, a topic of investigation, was not so much passion and emotion. So, of course, there are a number of scholars and intellectuals and philosophers who rehabilitate positive emotions. For example, Augustine in The City of God says that emotions like joy and peace are reflects of the happiness and beatitude in God, to which man is called, or something like this. But anyway, basically emotions are perceived by the classics as a perturbation that acts against the ideal course of human behavior. Of course, now the picture is, thank God, if I can say so, very different in a number of respects, right? But it is fascinating that within the domain of investigation of linguistic meaning and semantics, well, a form of disinterest still prevails about the emotional parts of what is communicated. Yeah, let me, first state this. Yeah, so current scholarship in language sciences tends to disregard the question of expressivity, which is the direct manifestation of emotion, affectivity in language, because it's deemed analyzable except from a few formal observations, which I will tell you a little bit about. But this is also pretty much true in pragmatics, in the pragmatics inspired by philosophers like Grice, but also if you look at Austin's philosophy of language, also these ordinary philosophers of the ordinary language philosophy authors. Austin has this category of expressive speech acts, but it is left completely untheorized. It is left, and still now there is not much about this in the literature or in the scholarship. It's not something that seems to be interesting to a number of people. If you look at the Port-Royal grammar in 1660, it was the most classical grammar, which is perhaps the landmark of this type of attitude. Well, there is this idea that is actually still prevailing in most of semantics, that logic is to the mind what grammar is to language. So grammar is the logic of language, but it is paralleled with the logic as an instrument of thinking. So language is logic, basically. So affective expression is completely excluded from the principle governing language, because those principles are logical. They are not something different than logical. And everything relating to passion or expressivity is out of those logical, is considered out of this logical apparatus that can help us understand language, right? So it's unworthy of scientific interest. And so in the grammar itself, they feel the need nonetheless to speak about interjections, which is perhaps the most obvious case of expressive items, expressions. And all they say is just 5 words saying that interjections do not mean anything, literally outside of us. So the interjections don't mean anything outside of us. Interjections are only natural voices that mark the movements of our soul, right? A question, of course, which is worth of interest is whether interjections refer to something at all. That's a question that for the moment, I leave on the side, but I'll try to say something about this a little bit later. It's the truth conditional tradition overall, that it's oriented towards propositional meaning, fact, truth, possible truth, state of affairs, everything of this kind, but not really about movements of the soul, as one would say, and which are expressed directly by such elements. So there's this rejection of emotion, that logic is to the mind what grammar is to language. The affective expression is excluded from the principles governing language. And this standpoint is actually challenged by a number of authors, starting from the 18th century, who will adopt an evolutionary point of view, even though it seems anachronic to speak about evolutionary point of view in the 18th century. However, the idea by these scholars, who are sort of exceptions, but very important exceptions, the idea is that the expression of emotion is something primary and constitutes the basis on which propositional language was established. So the idea is, and I will give you a few quotations. The idea by these classical scholars, like philosophers like Rousseau, the idea is that the language was constructed on the basis of emotional expressive meanings, and then step by step it became abstract and propositional. And it's funny to see, I do not mention that in my slides, but it's funny to see that currently that's an hypothesis which is taken very seriously by people working on the evolution of language. I do not say that I agree or disagree that this is sound to me or not sound to me, but it is remarkable that a number of scholars who don't know about Rousseau's kinds of stances have this view or tend to adopt this perspective. I'm talking about the people working on, there's a big project in Switzerland called which is called Evolving Language, which is dedicated to the evolution of language, the origin of language, comparison with the communications and systems in primates and so on, and they tend to go in that direction. Yeah. So Rousseau quote, a quote by Rousseau, in his essay on the origins of language, he says the following: "We did not begin by reasoning, but by feeling. It is claimed that men invented speech to express their needs. This view seems to me to be untenable. The natural effect of the first needs was to dismiss men and not to bring people closer. He did so that the species might come to expand and the earth might be promptly populated, otherwise mankind would be piled up in one corner of the world and all the rest would remain deserted. Well, this is Rousseau, this is speculative, but there is this idea that something different must have taken place than exchanging information about the needs. Where might this origin of language come from? From moral needs, which he calls passions. All the passions tend to bring people back together again, but the necessity of seeking a livelihood forces them apart. It is neither hunger nor thirst, but love, hatred, pity, anger, which drew from them the first words. One can take nourishment without speaking, but for moving a young heart or repelling an unjust aggressor, nature dictates accents, cries, lamentations. There we have the invention of the most ancient words, and that is why the first languages were singable and passionate before they became simple, methodical. I'm just having this little path into the history of thought because it's interesting to see that these kinds of oppositions are still completely up to date, or almost completely up to date. Of course, there are some, we cannot endorse these kinds of view, of course, now without any distance, but still there is a touch of this which is still taking place now as in the debates on language. Now, Humboldt later says the following, Wilhelm von Humboldt: words are formed freely from the chest without necessity or intent. Without necessity or intent. This is interesting to see. So, and it may well be that there has never been a nomadic horde in any desert that has not already had its own songs, for man as a species is a singing creature, although notes in this case are also coupled with thoughts. The idea by Wilhelm von Humboldt here is simply that the first words were just spontaneous. There is a spontaneous way of expressing oneself. And if you think about what is most spontaneous, is of course the expression of feelings. And so let me skip the last quotation, not to the history of thought during the whole talk, right? And now let me come to a major figure of the theorization of emotion in language, affective meanings, and so on. This is Charles Bailly, who develops what one could call today an affective pragmatics. That's way before the word pragmatics comes into the landscape. But it's absolutely fascinating to see how the works by Charles Bailly announces or prefigurates what pragmatics is going to be in the 20th century. So in Bailly's work, you've got virtually everything: speech acts, relevance, the notion that language is economical or efficient in some way, that it is oriented towards action, but there is also this idea that was also sort of kept aside, left aside in the subsequent theories, that languages expresses the content of our thought, namely our ideas and feelings. He says the intellectual elements and the affective elements being almost always united in varying doses in the formation of thoughts. The same composition is reflected in language use. So he has a notion of thinking, of thought, which is not the formal notion that philosophers, in particular in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, have about thought, where thought is thought, if I can say so, as something propositional in nature, judgmental, made of sentences expressing truth or possible truth, or state of affairs and facts, etc., not emotions. Natural language, says Charles Bailly, is neither at the service of pure reason, neither of art. It does aim at an ideal, it doesn't aim at a logical ideal, nor at a literary ideal. It is simply at the service of life, not the life of some, but the life of all, and its manifestation. I would like to emphasize here the use of the word life. What Bailly means here is something of great importance, is the idea that language is also at the service of expressing what is lived, what people go through, what people experience. And this, of course, includes that particular aspect of human experience, which is emotions. Emotions affected the affective life. Where there is a quotation here, you can see it, and you will have it in my when I will send the PDF of the slides to Antonio. But basically here it's interesting to see here the original quotation. Bailly is a disciple, if you want, a disciple of Saussure, and he has taken from Saussure this challenge of doing some linguistics of parole, of use of parole, while Saussure, of course, claimed that proper linguistics is only about langue, the internal system, the idealized system, competence, if one wants to make a parallel with Chomsky. Bailly wants to see what's going on in parole, and he says that parole is also is basically a manifestation of language, which is at the same time biological and social, and this is almost a quotation of Saussure about langue. So what Bailly tells us is that sensory stimuli are translated into impressions and value judgments, what he called value judgments, that corresponds to all kinds of evaluations. And he makes a distinction between the expression of pure ideas, that is, propositions, and lived ideas. Lived ideas are those felt ideas or affect, emotions that are action-oriented. There's lots of things to comment on those 2 points. The first is very interesting to see that Bailly talks about impressions. Impressions are something we get from linguistic stimuli in some contexts with some particular items, perhaps with some packaging, also international and so on. We have impressions, we get impressions, but can we say that impressions are part of what meaning is part of what we call meaning? That can we say that those impressions are actually communicated, or how can we deal with this? That's an important question. Also, it's very important to see that Bailly suggests that these impressions are kinds of evaluations, and that is fascinating to see that contemporary theories of emotion, at least in philosophy, involve in a critical way, in a very central way, the idea that emotions are evaluation based. If I'm afraid of something, it's because I have an evaluation of some stimuli, of some stimulus. And at the same time, it's also important to see this idea of lived ideas, the manifestation of something I live, or should I say, other authors will say that as well, things that we experience. So in surplus of this, there is a whole theory of how affective meanings are inserted or calibrated in language use. He has a notion that he calls stylistics, a whole theory about the intrication of the two things. dictum and modus. Dictum is the propositional meaning, a modus is a mode of presentation, and that's the mode, and it's the mode of presentation which is embodying, if you want, or which is carrying the subjective appraisal or subjective emotion or affective meanings. Now, of course, the picture that we have between reason and passion, or reason emotion, is completely different. In particular, because there is a lot of work that have been pursued since the 70s, since the 1970s and so, that show that actually humans are not so reasonable. We do not really use analytical judgment in our choices. We resort to heuristics, which are biased, which are efficient, but which are also prone to errors in some cases. So in the contemporary view, to make a long story very short, we have something like this. Human reasoning as an instrument of logical decision making is actually systematically flawed by various cognitive biases led by heuristics. And at the same time, human reasoning is fit for collective decision making and is oriented towards better coordination and cooperation. Yeah. Here you've got, that's sort of what I take out of Mercier and Sperber's recent book, 2017, The Enigma of Reason. Now, emotion itself is intertwined with the exercise of rationality. It supposes appraisals, orients heuristics, attracts attention, modifies states of alertness, shapes interpretive contexts, etc. And here, that's the cover of a recent book also by Deona and Teroni, which is the perhaps the most up-to-date version of the most popular theory of emotion, or one of the most popular theory, I should say, of emotions in philosophy, called appraisal theory, which is backed up actually by a lot of experimental work. There's this big center for affective science where neuroscience scholars, and philosophers and linguists and every kind of people work together in this perspective. But still, in the current major approaches to language and communication, this classical divide somewhat remains prevalent, and the attention of scholars largely ignores emotion in language use. I remember personally, we had this invited talk on emotion in language, expressive meaning, and so on in our cognitive science seminar. And a colleague working in syntax who came over, was telling me afterwards that we'd better stick to propositional meaning, to the investigation of propositional meaning, yes, because as soon as you get out of what is strictly propositional, what is logic, if you prefer that word, you fall into the trap of being speculative, resorting on experimental neuroscience, intuitions, and so on. So still there is this notion that we should not be looking at this. So let me look at this a little bit. In a few words, overview of what we can call affects or emotions. And let me start with this quote by Ferenc Russell. Everyone knows what an emotion is, until asked to give a definition. That's basically what I was saying at the beginning of the talk. We all have a familiarity to emotions. We live emotions, we have emotions, we experience emotions. But then if we want to make that conscious, to make the category emotions something conscious, then it's complicated. We have, rather than one simple opposition, like reason and passion or reason and emotion, we find something more fuzzy, more vague, a list of opposing, sort of opposing concepts. So let me just propose this list. But what I want to say basically is, what I want to suggest is that these various distinctions that I will sort of just make appear on besides these two big things, can be, well, the various distinctions can be that can be drawn between those two worlds of the logical, the cognitive, and the emotional, sometimes called the conative. When we look at how they are communicated, they belong to two different overarching kinds. What I'd like to call what is meant and what is shared. So in close relation to this, I assume that the difference between the two in terms of contents is a difference between beliefs, what is held as true, possibly true states of affairs, facts, and experience. Yes. And besides, beyond these two differences, we can list a number of other dimensions. The propositional versus the non-propositional, the truth conditional versus the non-truth conditional. It's not exactly true that we can draw this distinction right here, but still there's a flavor of that. Descriptions, expressivity. What is effable? What is what you can describe? What we can describe, and what is ineffable, which is not this, which was can't describe, which resists description. It's true that when you have an interjection like ouch, we can only partially describe what it means. There is a little bit of that which is left impossible to spell out in full words. On one side, there's information. On the other side, there are impressions. Things like the conceptual, the declarative knowledge. On the other side, the procedural knowledge, what the know-hows and things like that. Knowledge and competence and so on. So let me stress straight away two main things. First, if affects are experienced rather than meant, then these experiences are shared, and they are shared by means of expressivity in language. Second, I'd like to emphasize that the distinction I am drawing here between communication, communicating propositions, and sharing experiences, let's say, is not a distinction between logic and heuristic, sound reasoning and risky inferences. What belongs to the cognitive domain is sometimes, but by far not exclusively, treated by the analytic, rational, central processing of information, but also, in fact, mostly in ordinary life by heuristics. Not only the well-known type of heuristics investigated since the seminal works by Tversky and Kahneman in the 70s, but also the heuristics of information processing that go through what the classical Petit and Cacioppo model calls the peripheral route of information processing, and are associated with the notion of persuasion, by the way. So these heuristics have a property that all pragmaticists know about very well. They are fast, they are frugal, as Gigerenzer puts it. So this shows that concepts like propositions, beliefs, thoughts, opinions, they do not necessarily arise as a result of demonstrative, cautious processing in analytical inferences and so on. They might just be the outcome of fast and frugal heuristics, of course. But what unites them is that they are propositional. They are about information. There are things that you can believe or not believe. They're truth conditional. They concern states of affairs. What is shared, on the other hand, at the same time, if I can say so, is not necessarily affective or emotional, but I will sort of leave aside these non-emotional, non-affective aspects of what is shared, of this big domain of the non-propositional. But I just need to point out or to mention that admittedly in the literature, the meaning of a number of grammatical items are also about non-propositional meaning, like connective, in particular discursive connectives, discourse connectives, like but and these typical elements are classified in some theories as procedural meanings. So these are also elements of meanings that are non-propositional. They are descriptively ineffable, as some scholar put it. They are procedural. They are about competences. They are not about impressions, however, and are not about affective meaning. So I'm not going to talk about that. Now, a very important distinction: information versus impressions. Let me look at two ways of reporting an event. That's an event that happened in 2000 that was reported by a journal, a newspaper article, and which says the following. On 23rd June 2000, the bulk ore carrier MV Treasure sank off Western South Africa between Dasson and Robben Islands, which individually currently support the largest and third largest colonies of African penguins, Sphenicus demersus. That's a way of describing an event, which is about communication, which is about information, which is about communicating information, sort of raw information. And then you've got another way of putting things, which is the following. Number 2. That's a poem by Susan Richardson. A swollen tongue of oil invades the sea. Its kiss is one of death, not of pleasure. The coasts, the throat it probes so ruthlessly. So that's a poetic way of telling the same story. And one could say that whereas first example communicates information, example 2 seems rather to share impressions. So when looking at affective meanings, when looking at this emotional dimension of sharing experiences, we end up finding things like poetic meanings, or meaning, if we can call this meanings. I'll look now at the distinction between the notion of propositional meaning and non-propositional meaning, or propositional and non-propositional dimensions of thought and language. So propositions are only one type among many of the mental states that communicative behavior can exhibit. Whereas semantics, for example, almost completely focuses on propositional meaning, and once again, I mentioned that once again, leaves aside the non-propositional meaning. But slurs, interjections, other expressive meanings do not belong to the propositional domain. Those moments of epiphany, in particular in literature, for example, are not of propositional nature. They are felt, but they still grant a certain quality of what has been said or what has been mentioned, or of a particular thinking. You find this in particular with metaphors, for example, in the particularly in illuminating metaphors. So you've got this illuminating feeling, which is induced by well-chosen creative metaphors, right? So this is not propositional. This is something you feel, right? And here you find the distinction between what belongs to the declarative knowledge, propositional knowledge, and what belongs to the procedural world, to the competences of processing those types of representations in a certain way. So it resembles, or it perhaps belongs to, the same domain of things like knowing how to ride a bike, knowing how to play the violin, things that you can't really explain how to do that, things you need to experience. And we need to experience those things in order to understand one another, right? So a non-trivial question here is whether what is called impressions or expressivity, and more generally the non-propositional world, can ultimately be reduced to propositional material despite appearances. That's the proposition that we'll find in cognitive pragmatics, or not, just as the competence of riding a bicycle can't be reduced to propositional knowledge, right? Emotions or affects as attractors of attention. Affects, emotional states, are absolutely fundamentally useful in order to prepare to prepare others, or to prepare oneself for action. And it does so in particular as by playing this role of attracting attention. And here's what Greenspan says: emotional states are commonly thought of as antithetical to reason, disorienting and distorting practical thought. However, there is also a sense in which emotions are factors in practical reasoning, understood broadly as reasoning that issues in action. At the very least, emotions can function as enabling causes of rational decision-making, insofar as they direct attention towards certain objects of thought and away from others. They serve to heighten memory and to limit the set of salient practical options to a manageable set suitable for quick and dirty decision-making. And here we have one of the big keys to understand why we have those emotions that we can share, attract attention. Okay, let me perhaps skip these notions, but you can refer to these quotations about emotions on the PDF that I will give Antonio. But just a note on appraisal theory, the second element on this slide: emotions are triggered by stimuli, and these triggers are the result of subjective evaluations. That's what Scherer and his team in the neuroscience of emotion say. Subjective evaluations or appraisals that concern the stimulus about its relevance or particular goal produce a tendency to action. So we see a similarity between different ways of viewing emotions. Basic emotion theory is the theory by Ekman, says that there's something universal in the expression of emotion, spontaneous expression of facial emotions. And so he says that they form a natural basis, a universal basis of devices that we use as humans in order to share emotions. But so they are part of our biological heritage, but from case to case there are variants, social, cultural variants of how they are used and how they are recognized, but some of them, the most basic ones, are universally recognized. So there's something universal. So this, what do I, well, I mention this simply because there's an idea that expressive meaning the direct manifestation of affects in language is something very primary, very universal, and that we recycle and use in different languages in different ways, but still with this triggering similar sorts of reactions. Okay, so I'll skip on this again. Right. Focus medicine 2B, yeah, great classic scholars in psychology and in particular in cognitive science, in the theory of how we manage information, manage and process information. For them, the mind is a toolbox managed by higher order procedures, and emotions are a special type of higher order procedures, sort of programs. So interesting to see emotions up as procedures, of course, because certainly we find a link with other things that are also procedural, but perhaps not emotional, strictly speaking. Emotion regulate and mobilize cognitive subroutines responsible for processing perceptions, directing attention again, choosing goals, assembling information, types and specialized inferences, psychological changes, etc. And for example, fear leads to a state of hyper alertness that makes it impossible to fall asleep, for example. The heart rate is too fast and so on. Yeah, okay. Find Darwin, and let me, I'm coming to a conclusion of this part, and then I'll turn to a few examples in just a second. Affects, a manifestation of affects, if we look at Darwin, there are remnants of archaic procedures. For example, the attitude of contempt can still be expressed by a kind of sneer, but this is a vestige of a preparatory act for the bite, and has all these elements that sort of connects also the notion of affect with the notion of orientation towards action towards someone. Right. A note now, before I turn to a clear example, a note on intentional affective communication, and from the spontaneous use of communicating devices or not communicating devices, of some physical devices, to intentional recycling use of these devices. For example, if you think about shivering, shivering is something we do naturally if we're cold, right? Without conscious control. If we're cold, we shiver, that's all. But if someone is looking at me and I shiver spontaneously, naturally, without even thinking about it, that person will be aware that I am cold, right? Because that person can interpret this sort of natural sign that I present to her without intention of presenting that, but that I manifest. But then in another situation, I can shiver still spontaneously, but I can be aware that the person will interpret this shivering as I'm cold, and she will be aware. And in a third way, I can shiver if I'm not cold, even if I'm not cold. Intentionally, if I'm not cold enough to be shivering naturally and spontaneously, then I would use this behavior in a sort of conventional way that is based on the spontaneous natural embodiment of what's going on when you're cold, right? And that would be an intentional act of communication. Sorry, I did not right. So the same thing will apply or applies to other manifestations of mental states, and in particular to expressive behavior, to behaviors intended to evoke an affect. They can be exploited intentionally. For example, I can smile, and we know, of course, that's very, very conventional to smile in certain circumstances, but then we recycle or we use intentionally type of behavior that we also sometimes adopt naturally and spontaneously, right? So intentional smiles, eyebrow raising. If you're surprised of something, you know, expression of surprise universally is eyebrow raising. But if you want to manifest to make manifest that you're surprised, then you can intentionally raise your eyebrows, and that's going to be interpreted immediately as a sign of an affective meaning, but that's going to be intentionally conveyed. Our expressive language can do this. And we can overplay, of course, or natural intonations. You know, if we are excited, we have spontaneously some intonations. So there's a whole lot of things about intonations to speak about, of course. But think about good news that you got. And if it's a fantastic news, spontaneously you can say fantastic with that intonation, right? But we can also fake this intonation just to be nice to someone who got good news, or that we want to congratulate. And what do we do actually if I do something that you tell me a good news and that you got your degree or something, and I say fantastic. So what do? I manifest something very important, that I'm sharing the emotional affect, the emotional state that I suppose that you are in. You are excited, so I am sort of mimicking your own spontaneous way of expressing yourself if you've got a good news. So it's all about sharing. That's a very, very important thing. So let me turn now to expressivity in language for some examples. So expressivity in language, that can be that concerns one particular type of the manifestation of affects. It's about the direct communication of affect, or the direct manifestation of affects, which resorts to things that are ambiguous between spontaneous or intentional, like ouch, for example, these expressives and interjections, which can also be used intentionally with ostension. There's a whole other way of manifesting emotion, which is the description of emotions, which I'm not going to address here now. So the manifestation of emotions, which is for which we resort to descriptions. These what we'll call the secondary affective effects. Like I'm sad, I love this. Of course, this also triggers emotional reactions, but completely differently. That's so I focus on the direct type of case. Let me look at the first example, which is irony. I'll take 3 examples. Irony, one could say, well, is this emotional in any sense, or is it affective in any sense? Well, in fact, yes, it is. Irony is about attitudes. It's an attitude, and the attitude bears something affective or experiential in a particular way. If you look at this type of examples, classical example, oh, great weather for a picnic while it's raining, for example. I love it when you drive safely, as we're driving like hell. That's typical examples of ironical utterances. In particular, example 2 is a classical example to show that irony is not saying the contrary that you think. It's more subtle than that. It involves attitudes. The classical analysis of irony is things like dissociation with an enunciator, that's Ducrot's approach, pretense, pretending, faking something, or echoing a thought with an attitude, with adding an attitude. Irony communicates an attitudinal effect, and this attitudinal effect is irreducible. You cannot spell it in propositional information. It is ineffable. Well, if you want to spell out exactly what an example like to is actually saying or meaning, well, it's something like, if I said that I appreciate when you, or love it when you drive safely now, it would be ridiculous given the context of you driving like hell or something. But if you do like this, if you translate this into a full-fledged proposition or phrase, then the attitude itself is lost. It's not a rephrasing or translation, it's losing the attitudinal part. That's something we discussed in a 2009 paper. There's a reference somewhere. And also think about how we describe ironies in ordinary speech, in ordinary conversation. We talk about biting irony or chilling irony, but these are, these are not something that belong to descriptions. Attitudes, not descriptions, are biting, chilling. These are properties that have to do not with facts or state of affairs or descriptions, but with form of action on others that involve their affect. You're feeling bitten, feeling icy, feeling hurt, and something like that. So, yeah. So irony, attitudinal elements like irony are ineffable, and so you can we can imagine that they are not about conveying propositions, but they are about sharing something, sharing an impression, sharing an experience, sharing something that is felt, an affect. Second example, so let me skip this. Second example, expressives. And expressives are those things like interjections, for example. Ouch is a typical example of an expressive meaning, interjection. And it's easy to see that the meaning of ouch involves or includes or encompasses the meaning of the notion, the propositional notion or description into I'm in pain, but they involve also a non-truth conditional element, which is really the expressive element. If you look at these examples here, you see that what we can do with descriptions, we can't do with expressives. Someone says it hurts, one may react, no, it's wrong, I know, whatever. Or same thing with a question, does it hurt? Yes. But if that's about ouch, then you can't say it's wrong, that ouch does not make any sense. Or does it hurt? Ouch is not an answer unless we add something to the theory that makes it possible to have an expressive of an answer to this, but that's propositional. That's not propositional. So it could be argued that they are subjective in some certain sense, that then they are like some models, not scrutable, that you can't, that they are immune to contradictions or things like that. But also they are non-redundant. So there's something more than that. They are non-redundant with respect to their propositional content. If someone says, ouch, it hurts, there is no redundancy, right? As you would find with simply, it hurts, it hurts. This would be redundant. Even though it hurts is possible, of course, meaning pragmatically that it hurts very much or so on. But ouch, it hurts, is not redundant. Another type of expressives is those kinds of what Manuel Padilla Cruz calls expletive expressives. which you have here in this little joke. Where's my F word jacket? Over there next to your regular one. My what? Never mind. Showing that the F word here is in a position of an adjective here, but certainly not behaving as an adjective, it's behaving as something different. And it's easy to see that it's not an adjective in its function, in its semantic or even pragmatic function, because we can't do the things that are here as an answer to where's my F jacket. No, it's not F word, or it's not true that it's F word jacket. But there are semantic ways to deal with this. So there's a semantic analysis that follows from works by Kaplan. Kaplan has a well-known, very short article about the meaning of ouch. And Potts is the semanticist who has theorized abundantly expressive meaning. So their idea is that expressives contribute to providing information about the speaker emotional state. Certainly everyone can agree with this, of course. So Kaplan says that interjections are indexical and part of the semantics of language use. Fine, they're certainly indexicals. But has an idea that yes, a form of logic is able to address expressivity, but by introducing a dimension of the description, a dimension of what the meaning is about, and that's the expressive dimension, where that dimension is making elements of the context of interpretation. And he gives, for example, the example one, the damn dog. The damn dog, sort of damn here means that the dog is bad, but the dog is bad in the what he calls the expressive dimension. So there is another dimension, that the propositional dimension proper, that is the expressive dimension, where the dog, sorry, is bad. Now there is a very strong objection to this kind of analysis. It's certainly an intuitive objection, it's a very strong one, I think, that the damn dog does not communicate one prime that the dog is bad at all, even in the expressive dimension, but rather an emotional state of the speaker about the dog, but which has nothing to do with the qualities attributed to the dog itself. Just as where's my F jacket has no appreciation of the qualities of the jacket at all. And that's an important thing. You can think of many situations where one can say, where's the damn dog? Where we love the dog and that dog is lovely, but damn is just that we need to find it, perhaps because it's in danger or whatever. It's not that there is anything bad about the dog. There's nothing bad. There is something bad about the dog in that context. So it's not that the dog is bad in any way. All right. Impressions then. Creative metaphors is a case in point with metaphors. Like Juliet is the sun, that's Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So Romeo says Juliet is the sun. And here the idea that is that we have the meaning of that sentence is conveying impressions. You can find other metaphors, creative metaphors. There's another one here by Flaubert in French, and the same seems to appear, at least that's what Sperber and Wilson say in their 2015 paper, which I will mention in a moment, that the same happens with nonverbal types of behaviors that are directed to interlocutors or to other people. For example, Pierre and Marie have just arrived in their hotel room by the sea. Mary opens the window and sighs ostentatiously, in comfort. She sighs, And so she communicates something which is not determinate. And that's the key for Spur and Wilson to say that it's not determinate, so it's an impression. About the creative metaphor, Juliet is the sun. If you look at what literary scholars say, they could say things like this, as Cavell, 1965, quoted by Spur and Wilson in 2015. Romeo means that Juliet is the warmth of his world, that his day begins with her, that only in her nourishment can he grow. And his declaration suggests that the moon, which other lovers use as emblem of their love, is merely a reflected light and dead in comparison, and so on. The "and so on," which ends my example of paraphrase, is significant. It registers what William Empson calls the pregnancy of metaphors, the burgeoning of meaning in them. So Spur and Wilson will say that impressions are sets of meanings, actually. They will not say sets of meaning, they will say arrays of propositions. So here their theory is that still all these are propositions. It's still propositional meaning. There's nothing emotional, strictly speaking, or affective, strictly speaking, in such kinds of things. But they are arrangements of propositions. Arrays is a sort of ordered list of propositions, but of propositions that are, and they have this property, yes, very important, propositions that are weakly manifest propositions. Sets are arrays of weakly manifest propositions, and each reader will take this or that proposition, not being so sure that this is the one intended by the author. And what do they say? They say the following: what is an impression? In section 1, we use the example of Mary, newly arrived on holiday, sniffing appreciatively and ostensibly at the fresh seaside air in order to share an impression with Peter. And I find it very important to notice that they use the notion of sharing an impression. They do not say communicate a thought. And still, they would like to keep it propositional, but no. Let me skip this and go and head slowly towards my conclusions. I will add a few elements in the conclusion. So what's the nature of meaning if we look at a cognitive theory like relevance theory? Well, meaning is contextually constructed by inferences aiming at disambiguating and saturating reference, clarifying the meaning of conceptual expressions, achieving other pragmatic enrichments of various meanings that leads to explicature, that the explicit propositional meaning, which the speaker cannot plausibly deny, that's to use wording by Steven Pinker and colleagues, and to implicatures, strong and weak implicatures through other contextual inferences, which are processed differently than Grice would say, but still resemble conversational implicatures. Intentional meaning. Meaning is intentional, and that's an issue with poetry, that's an issue with many things, perhaps not so intentional, or perhaps intentional, but without intention of being intentionally clear, or something like this. Well, meaning is intentional. So communication in general, but especially through language, is an individual problem-solving situation. Communication is not only intentional, but doubly intentional. Comprehending is about understanding an information, and at the same time understanding that the understanding of this information is expected, or is the intention of the speaker using the stimulus. So this requires the theory of mind reading skills, figuring out what could be the intention of a speaker using this sentence in that context, with some guides, and a guide or guideline, if you want, is the principle of relevance, that any utterance communicates a presumption that it is worth spending the mental effort processing it, as it is expected to lead to a commensurate informative cognitive effect. That's the law of least effort, that we expect more effects and less efforts, and a balance between the two things. How can we integrate affective effects in such a picture? Yes. If we're dealing only with propositions, then that's okay, because we can use Sperber and Wilson last bit of development of the theory in the 2015 paper and say, well, these are just weak implicatures. Impressions are weak implicatures, and affective effects are about this kind of things. But, well, no, if they are not propositional, and so they would be experiential effects, so their relevance would be about ringing a bell, if this expression makes any sense. So if Romeo says Juliet is the sun, this will make sense to anyone having an experience, a personal experience of anything related to love, but certainly not much effect to, let's say, for example, child which has not yet raised any interest for the other sex, or any, sorry, for any other person having relation of love, or feelings of love. Yes. So there are several elements that can enter the picture here. Emotional or affective effects can be analyzed from the perspective of being precursors of the search for relevance as attention attractors, therefore acting as drastic reducers on the effort dimension as attractors of attention. As signs giving access to information, of course, also. We do interpret ouch as a natural sign of pain, just as smoke is a natural sign of fire. And of course, if someone says ouch, we understand something like I'm in pain, or that person is in pain. Even though it would be wrong to say that the person saying ouch is saying or even meaning something like I am in pain. It means there's something else going on. So if we want to account for this, we can perhaps integrate in the theory something like those effects as activating a certain type of mental response, which is not purely cognitive, which is not only cognitive, but is also affective. What is that? That is where theory of mind perhaps can be supplemented or should be supplemented by other device or resources of the human mind to project and to understand other people, like simulation or other kinds of empathy theories of this kind. So what should I say at this stage? That I would say that affective markers should be introduced in the processing as effort-reducing devices, as attention attractors, and as inducer of affective effects. The affective effects is a response that does not necessarily impose an interpretation of intentions, but presupposes access to memorial traces of previous experiences and imagination. The idea is that we interpret ouch in reference to our own past experience of pain. And this involves a form of psychological simulation of the episode of pain. Just a note on processing effort. A reduced processing effort in order to grasp information increases the feeling of relevance, and perhaps we should even add to the theory the idea that relevance is a feeling of some sort. The more relevant the communication, the more reliable it seems. That's also a claim that has not been put forward very clearly, except for in a few papers. And I've worked a little bit on some aspects of persuasion where I suggest that this is an important thing, that the more relevant the communication, the more persuasive it is. And that we evaluate highly relevant communication with a higher degree of confidence. So this leads to epistemic effects, persuasive effects of epistemic, affective effect, emotional persuasion, communication. Sorry, right. On the contrary, an excessive effort supposes a complex message to match relevance expectation, and if we fail to find the match, to match the threshold of relevance, we won't pay attention, right? So complicated messages are less likely to attract attention, and then less likely to be persuasive. Most or less complex messages are more likely to be persuasive and add to this emotion. And you've got here a key, or elements to explain what is going on with emotional communication. Right. If I still have 1 or 2 minutes, I'll skip this. I'll just mention 3 quick cases. Do I have a few minutes more?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, very good. So let me add a little bit, a little thing about this persuasive effect or epistemic effect. So let me go straight to examples. Yeah. The first example I want to mention is one by a famous intellectual lawyer, in fact, a famous lawyer in France, Robert Badinter. Robert Badinter is the lawyer who became a minister of justice and realized or obtained the banishment of the death penalty in France. So he's very well known for being the man who managed to persuade the parliament to vote a law abolishing the death penalty. And it all began when he managed to persuade, as a lawyer, as an attorney, as a lawyer, he managed to push the criminal court to not condemn criminals to the death penalty. So there was a big trial with 6 convicted for murder. Murder they have committed together, a horrible thing, and he made his speech in the jury, in front of the jury, and he persuaded the jury not to vote for the death penalty of these people. And then recently on the TV, there was just a few years ago, he was explaining the following. So that's my translation. If unfortunately you read, then you're lost. The reason I was able to save them, those convicted, was not because the language or the argumentation was perfect. The reason is different. It's that I addressed them, as the Italians say, naked face. They must feel that I am a man warning them against the trap set up for them and in which they are about to fall. That here is a man who is telling them, don't do that. Right. That's his way of explaining his own rhetoric for convincing that they were successful in convincing or persuading the member of the jury. So he basically says that he owes his success to his direct appeal to emotion rather than to reasoning over propositions. That's quite important. That led to the end of the death penalty in France. So that's not incidental. That's not just a little thing. That's not an epiphenomenon in language that we use those resources. That's the good side of emotion. There is an epiphanic effect of what we could call emotional congruence. Of course, there are dangers to this. I'll see that in a second. So the idea is that Badinter's speech in the tribunal overtly called for a mirroring of the emotional experience, a simulation of what it will be in terms of feelings in the future if they vote for the death penalty. So it represents affects and calls for simulating them in the minds of the member of the jury. So the members of the jury have to use their imagination and their memories to figure out how they will cope with the idea of having voted for the killing of a man, for the death penalty. This resembles what we have, this epiphanic effect resembles what we find in some literary effects, poetry, for example. Epiphanic moment, that's an important thing. It's a common outcome of the appeal to emotion. It's not, of course, always, but it is a common outcome of that. But of course, the problem is that these epiphanic moments or these epiphanic effects, they happen also with the roughest type of populist persuasion. And if you think about Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," there is this notion that there's a feeling of loss. You have this example, "Make America Great Again." So this slogan, this basically this little phrase, imperative phrase, "Make America Great Again," that there was already was the slogan by Ronald Reagan, as you see, "Let's make America great again." It triggers an emotional sort of reaction of the kind that we saw. But it's sort of the other side of the coin, right? Make America great again. So there is a neuropsychological theory that explains a number of things here, and that's prospect theory. So "Make America Great Again" activates a presupposition. That's interesting because sometimes a presupposition will play the role of introducing affective effects as something that still has to be theorized and explained, because usually presuppositions are only thought about in terms of accommodations of meanings, propositions, and all that. Sometimes they play a role, not only a persuasive role in terms of inserting a proposition as a potential belief in the hearer's mind, but also triggering further on emotional reactions that can just favor this or that course of action, like, for example, voting for that guy who has no experience in politics at all. So prospect theory says that risk-taking attitudes are adopted more easily after experiencing a loss. And if you think about this slogan, "Make America Great Again," the presupposition triggered by "again," which is a classical semantic presupposition, raises two elements: that America is not great, and that America used to be great, as a conclusion that there was a loss, right? A loss of greatness. Then what is not accounted for really by prospect theory is an emotional notion associated with loss, and we can theorize it very easily with an idea of frustration. So the slogan "Make America Great Again" generates frustration, right? These frustrations, this feeling of frustration, I did not mention frustration in the slide, I should have. I will add this before I send you the PDF. So that feeling of frustration is the root of that will for action, for that will to vote for that guy. It's not only, but if you say it's just experiencing is important here. Experiencing a loss triggers risk-taking attitude, but that's because there is a feeling involved. There is an emotional aspect in here, which is frustration of loss. All right, and then I will end with this little slide that saying that there is room for going on and explore all this in much more detail. That I'm just sketched here a few elements, right? But there is room to explore this, and people have started now working seriously on this in pragmatics, and in particular, looking at literature and poetry. And it's interesting to see that from its very origins, pragmatics, and in particular, the relevance theory kind of pragmatics, cognitive, so to say, pragmatics, have been interested in literary effects, in poetry and literature. And so if we take literature to produce, in particular, fiction, to produce secondary affective effects by ex post, afterwards, experiential resonance of linguistic interpretation, then we can imagine an approach for which the scenes that are described in a novel, for example, activates affective effects by simulation based on experiential memory traces, and that poetry produces impressions as is theorized or is begun to be theorized here or in this trend of research, that it shares experience rather than communicates information. And one important element here is that if you read a novel, or if you read the poetry in particular, at no time will you as a reader wonder what the intentions of the authors are. That's the worry for literary criticism, for scholars, but that's not an issue for the reader, right? Not at all. We don't probably even figure out that there is an intention. We read the novel, we are witnessing things. So we are simulating the position of a witness. Also, we are simulating experiences. This produces what Spurgeon and Wilson call a metacognitive acquaintance. This is a whole other aspect of how emotional meanings, affective meanings come into play, and what their outcome is, that there is perhaps in the end a fundamental resemblance or kinship between the most sublime poetry, right, and the expression of the grossest swear word. That I like this idea of making my conclusion here. That is, well, what makes us human is mostly something that manifests itself in the most roughest aspects of communication and in the most sublime aspects of communication, just as persuasion based on emotion can lead to the best and to the worst. And these non-propositional things bring us back to a non-propositional human essential. And here I say, thank you for your attention and your references here.
Thank you so much, Professor de Saussure. Ahora vamos a abrir un espacio de preguntas por si alguien quiere hacer alguna intervención. Lo puede levantar la mano o lo puede hacer por el chat. Adelante, Gabriela.
Gracias. Thank you very much for your talk. I really liked it a lot, especially the historical path that you traced. And I wrote my dissertation on historical politeness in medieval Spanish. And at first I was, very concentrated on directive speech acts. But when I was analyzing the text, it struck me as very interesting that expressive speech acts were very important, but not just on their own, because they were actually very relevant for the interpretation of the directive speech acts. And they were also, you know, recurring, like when people threatened one another, they would recur to feelings of love and friendship with this speech acts that would be considered like threatening, you know, like negative, but they would use these expressive speech acts with positive feelings of friendship and love. So that last part that you said, the relationship or the kinship between poetry and swear words, I really like that conclusion. And I wanted to ask you, or I wanted to know a little bit more about your current research projects on this topic.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's very interesting what you say about directive speech acts and directive attitudes or other types of attitudes. Clearly, that's a very nice example of how the propositional and the non-propositional act together. The directive speech act in particular is prompting for action, right? So it's really a case in point. It's really an obvious case where you want to supplement this with other action-oriented things like emotional sorts of attitudes, threatening and things like that. Yeah, there's a reinforcing kind of way. And in other contexts, it shows that directive speech act can have various flavors, right? In other contexts, of course, talking about how friends we are is about turning it into a sort of a request or a demand, right? So we've got it all depends on what context will be more appropriate or will more successful in the outcome. So it's very interpersonal. It's very about it's lots about subjective attitudes and intersubjective and social relationship that binds the people together. About my current research projects, well, basically we've got that book that is appearing I think this month in a week or two in the Cambridge University Press, Pragmatics and Emotion, where we have more developments on this, on what I said, of course. And now an interesting thing is that it opens to looking in a different way to looking at poetry and literature. So what I'm interested in now is this topic in particular, how what the links are between expressive meanings and poetry. What does it mean in terms of human behavior and in particular human verbal linguistic behavior? One thing that strikes me with poetry is that it has something spontaneous, not in the real sense of spontaneity that it comes up like that without control, but there is a little bit of that because it comes up. I mean, if you ask poets what they are doing, quite often they would not really tell you that they are writing poetry in order for someone to understand them. That's not really the goal that they pursue, generally speaking. They prefer to say that they express themselves. So they couch on paper something that they hold in their interior life, in their personal experience. And then, interestingly, this becomes an instrument of sharing something. But sometimes it's just without their own will. So there's a central notion of communication which is absent from this. Communication is traditionally viewed as a process where the interpreter, the addressee, reconstructs the intentional meaning of the communicator. But that's not really what's happening in poetry, and perhaps not with other types of literature. So I'm interested in that. I've got a paper published in 2021, so recent paper dedicated to this. but now I've got a PhD student working specifically on that, and I'm eager to see the results of that.
Thank you very much. I will look for your paper and tell Antonio to request a copy of your upcoming book for the Instituto's library.
I can send the PDF of the paper if you want, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
¿Alguna otra consulta o intervención? Adelante, Antonio.
Yes, merci beaucoup, Louis. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I had a project on emotional taxonomy, and the question it should be built automatically on the internet in artificial intelligence methodologies.
Yeah. Okay.
And the first question we have with this project is: are emotions and passions language specific? Because we found that between English and Spanish is not quite the same, and it remembers me the situation with colors. Can we comment about it?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and the question is, if you want to classify them, are you going to use a linguistic-driven apparatus? And of course, we don't really see how we can do something different, right, than using a linguistic-based apparatus. So we have ready-made categories, and the categories with emotion differ from one language to another, just as any other categorization differs. But the question probably is whether these categories can be deconstructed to some extent. And I don't know, actually, if that's possible with emotions, but in other domains, classical methodologies in order to break down the concepts into other categories, into more atomic bits, combine elements. So table is made of this and that, and you can combine that and see that in some language, one word will be okay for a number of tables, but not for a number of other tables that have this feature in surplus. So if you take that surplus bit off, then you come to a more essential kind of thing. Perhaps that's, I don't know if that's possible to do. I've never done a semantic analysis of this kind for emotional words, but then it raises another kind of questions, which is whether we think of emotions and we live them, perhaps, in terms of our native language or not. That would be a Sapir-Whorfian view on that. And certainly, it's certainly wrong if we take it to the full determination, of course. But there might be a zone of where the fine-tuning of how we feel is influenced to a little extent, perhaps, by these kind of things. But that's all I can say basically on that. But that's fascinating. It's a very interesting project. I would love to know more about it.
Thank you. Yes, for sure.